Welcome. Find a comfortable position, allow your shoulders to drop, and let the concerns of the modern world fade gently into the background. Tonight, we journey back across the centuries to medieval Europe, to a time so distant from our own that its rhythms, its textures, its very air would feel utterly foreign to us now. The medieval period stretched across 1,000 years, from roughly the 5th century to the 15th, and within that vast span of time lived countless millions whose names we will never know. Their lives unfolded in patterns we can barely imagine, governed by seasons and saints' days, by feudal obligations, and the ever-present shadow of the church. Tonight we will walk among them, feel the weight of their burdens, and understand the world they inhabited. We begin at the bottom of the social hierarchy, in the cramped, smoky darkness of a peasant's cottage. We will spend time there, in that one-room hovel, understanding what it meant to wake each morning to a life of unrelenting toil. Then we will follow the extraordinary story of one peasant girl who defied every expectation of her station, whose visions and victories shook the foundations of kingdoms. After that, we turn our attention upward to the soaring stone forests of Gothic cathedrals and ask how such impossible beauty was achieved by people who lacked our mathematics, our machinery, our certainty. And finally, we will step through monastery gates into a world of surprising comfort and learning, where some medieval people lived lives of scholarship and relative ease. The contrast between these worlds, all existing simultaneously within the same historical moment, is part of what makes the medieval period so endlessly fascinating. But for now, let yourself settle deeper into stillness. Breathe slowly. The journey begins in darkness, in the hour before dawn, in a cottage that smells of earth and animals and yesterday's fire. Imagine yourself waking in near total darkness. The hour is uncertain, you possess no clock, but your body knows the rhythms of labor so thoroughly that you need no timepiece. The cottage around you is a single room, perhaps 20 feet by 15, with walls of wattle and daub, that ancient mixture of wooden lattice packed with mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung. The roof above is thatched, perpetually settling, perpetually in need of repair. When rain falls, it drips through in a dozen places, and you have learned which parts of the floor turn to mud first. The darkness is not quite complete. A tiny window, unglazed and covered with a wooden shutter, admits the faintest suggestion of pre-dawn grey. There is no chimney. The fire pit in the center of the room has been banked overnight, its embers carefully covered with ash to preserve the coals, because starting a new fire from scratch is laborious, requiring either flint and steel or the humiliation of borrowing flame from a neighbor. The smoke from this fire has no proper escape except through a hole in the roof and the general gaps in the thatched ceiling. Your eyes have long since adjusted to constant irritation. Your lungs, too, have adapted, though you cough often, as does everyone. You share this space with your family, perhaps a wife or husband beside you, children sleeping on straw pallets, and also animals. A pig, certainly, for nearly every peasant household keeps at least one, perhaps some chickens roosting in the rafters. In winter, if you are fortunate enough to have access to a cow or ox, the animal might be brought inside, its body heat contributing to the meager warmth. The smell is what it is. You have never known anything else. The distinction between human habitation and animal shelter is a luxury belonging to other people. People whose lives unfold in stone manors and castles you may glimpse from a distance but will never enter. The floor beneath you is packed earth. In summer it is dusty, in winter it is damp, and always it is uneven. You sleep on a thin mattress stuffed with straw, replaced when the old straw has broken down into dust and chaff. Your blanket is coarse wool, scratchy, often damp from the perpetual moisture that pervades everything. You own perhaps 2 sets of clothing, 3 if you are unusually prosperous. One set you wear, one is being washed or mended. The clothing is simple, A long tunic of undyed wool or linen, perhaps brown or grey, tied at the waist with a rope. In colder months, you add more layers of the same rough fabric. Shoes are wooden clogs or leather boots so basic they are barely more than shaped hide bound to your feet with strips of leather. Many go barefoot in summer, saving the shoes for winter and the Lord's service. You rise. Movement is stiff, for the work is hard, and your body is perpetually sore. You are likely in your 20s or 30s, but your body feels older. Most peasants do not live past 40. Disease, injury, infection from the simplest wound, childbirth for women, or simple accumulated exhaustion claims people at ages we would consider young. There is no retirement. You work until your body fails, and then you depend on your children or the uncertain charity of the parish. The fire must be revived. You kneel beside the pit, carefully brush aside the ash, and blow gently on the embers beneath. A few small sticks, then larger ones, and eventually the fire catches. Light, precious light, begins to fill the cottage. The smoke rises and spreads, and eventually finds its way out through the roof hole, but not before filling your lungs once more. You are preparing the morning meal, which is the same as yesterday's meal and the meal before that. Pottage. Pottage is what peasants eat. It is a thick stew, perpetually simmering in an iron pot suspended over the fire. Into this pot goes whatever is available. Dried peas or beans, onions if you have them, a little cabbage, perhaps some root vegetables. Grain, usually barley or oats, thickens it. Meat is a rarity, appearing perhaps on feast days or when an animal dies unexpectedly. The pottage sits over the fire continuously, new ingredients added as others are consumed, the pot rarely emptied and washed. The taste is bland, the texture is mushy, and you eat it with a wooden spoon or simply by dipping bread into it. The bread is black bread, coarse and heavy, made from rye or barley, or a mixture of grains including things that in better circumstances would be considered unsuitable for human consumption. Wheat bread, white and fine, is for the nobility and wealthy merchants. Your bread is dense, sometimes gritty with impurities from the grinding stone, and it requires strong teeth and patient chewing. But it fills the belly, and that is what matters. You eat this bread and pottage twice a day, perhaps 3 times if the harvest has been good. There is no variety, no spices except perhaps a little salt if you can afford it, no sweetness except the occasional luxury of honey. The church mandates fast days, numerous throughout the year, on which meat, eggs and dairy are forbidden. For you, this prohibition is almost meaningless, because you rarely have access to these foods anyway. The wealthy fast by eating elaborate fish dishes and carefully prepared vegetable courses. You fast by eating your regular pottage with perhaps even less in it than usual. The irony is not lost on you, but such observations remain unspoken. Complaint is dangerous. As dawn breaks properly, the cottage becomes more visible in its entirety. The walls are bare, except perhaps for a few pegs holding tools or extra clothing. There is a rough table, a bench or two, and little else. No decoration, no artwork, no books, for you cannot read. Literacy is the province of clergy and nobility. Your knowledge is oral, passed down through generations, lodged in memory and practical demonstration. You know the land, the seasons, the crops, the animals. You know prayers and saints' days. You know songs and stories that have been told for centuries, but you do not know letters. Breakfast finished, the real work begins. You are a villain, a peasant bound to the land of a lord. This means you are not technically a slave. You cannot be sold apart from the land. But you are not free either. You cannot leave the manor without permission. You cannot marry without the lord's consent and usually the payment of a fine. Your labor belongs, in significant part, to him. The medieval social structure is often described as a pyramid, with the king at the top, then nobles, then knights, then free peasants, and then you at the very bottom along with the serfs. who are even less free, if such a distinction can be made. The Lord owns the land, vast fields that stretch across the manor. Some of this land is held directly by the Lord, worked for his exclusive benefit. This is called the domain. The rest is divided into strips and parcels, allocated to peasant families. You have your strips scattered across different fields in the open field system. This scattering is deliberate, meant to distribute both good and poor soil fairly. You might have a strip in the south field, another in the north field, another in the east. Walking between them consumes time. But before you can work your own land, you must work the Lord's. This is called corvée labor, obligatory service. Several days a week, sometimes 3, sometimes more depending on the season and the terms of your bondage, you must labor on the domain. Plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting. The best hours of daylight, the strength of your back, given to another man's prosperity. Only after these obligations are fulfilled can you turn to your own strips, working them in the hours that remain, often after the sun has already begun its descent. You walk to the Lord's fields in the company of other peasants, a silent or quietly murmuring procession. The work is overseen by the Lord's reeve, a bailiff chosen from among the peasantry, and by his servants. They watch to ensure the work is done properly and quickly. Shirking is noted and punished, perhaps with fines or additional labor. The tools you carry are simple: a wooden plow tipped with iron if you are fortunate, a sickle for reaping, a flail for threshing, a hoe for weeding. These tools are precious, maintained carefully, because replacing them is expensive and difficult. Plowing is perhaps the most exhausting labor. The plow is heavy, the soil is often resistant, and the ox or horse pulling it must be guided with constant attention. You walk behind the plow for hours, your hands gripping the handles, your back bent, your feet stumbling over the uneven ground. The furrows must be straight, the depth consistent. If you own no animal, you might pull the plow yourself, harnessed like a beast while another guides it. This is not unusual. Many peasants lack the resources for draft animals. The seasons govern everything. Spring is for plowing and planting. Summer is for weeding and tending, for praying that rain comes but not too much, that sun shines but not so fiercely it scorches the crops. Autumn is for harvest, the most frantic and crucial time of year. Every hand is needed. Children as young as 5 or 6 work in the fields, gathering grain, scaring birds, carrying water. The elderly, bent and slow, do what they can. The harvest must be brought in quickly, before weather or animals or simple decay destroys it. You work from first light until darkness makes it impossible to continue, collapsing each night into exhausted sleep. And from this harvest, the Lord takes his share, a significant share, often 1/3 or more of everything you produce. This is in addition to the labor you have already given. Then the church takes its share, the tithe, 1/10 of your produce. Then the Lord requires fees for using his mill to grind your grain, his oven to bake your bread, his woods to gather firewood, though even then you are permitted only deadfall, not to cut living trees. The fees accumulate, small individually but together crushing. What remains is barely enough to sustain your family through the winter. The fear of famine is constant. 1 bad harvest and starvation looms. 2 bad harvests in succession and people die. You have seen this. You have watched neighbors weaken and sicken and fail. You have seen children with swollen bellies and dull eyes. You have seen the old simply lie down one day and not rise. The church preaches that suffering is virtuous, that poverty brings you closer to God, that the meek shall inherit the earth. Perhaps this brings comfort. Perhaps it only makes the hunger more bitter. Winter is particularly hard. The work continues, though it changes in character. Animals must be tended, tools repaired, buildings maintained. There is spinning and weaving, the production of cloth from wool or flax, work that fills the long, dark evenings. The women particularly bear this labor, their hands never idle, spinning thread on simple drop spindles hour after hour, day after day. The light is poor, just the fire and perhaps a rushlight, a reed soaked in fat that sputters and smokes. Your eyes strain, your back aches, but the work must be done. You are cold in winter. The fire provides warmth only if you are very close to it. The rest of the cottage remains bitterly chill. Frost forms on the inside of the walls. Your breath mists in the air. You sleep in your clothing, huddled together with your family for shared warmth. The animals likewise pressed close. Chilblains affect your fingers and toes, painful swelling from the cold. Illness sweeps through communities in winter. Coughs, fevers, fluxes of the bowels. Many who survive the winter emerge weakened, and some do not emerge at all. Yet life continues. Marriages happen, usually arranged by families with an eye toward economic benefit, though affection sometimes grows. Children are born, often many children, though many also die in infancy or childhood. Disease claims them, accidents claim them, simple malnutrition claims them. A family might have 8 or 10 births and see only 3 or 4 children reach adulthood. This is simply how life is. Grief is constant, but must be borne quietly, for there is always more work. The manor is the center of your world. You likely never travel more than a dozen miles from the place of your birth. The nearest town might be a day's walk, visited perhaps once or twice a year for a market or fair. The wider world exists in rumor and story. Wars happening in distant places, kings rising and falling, heresies and crusades. These things do not touch you directly, though sometimes the Lord's men come to conscript peasants for military service, or the tax burden increases because the king needs funds for some foreign adventure. But mostly, the wider world is an abstraction. Your reality is the manor, the fields, the village, the church. The church stands at the center of the village, stone where everything else is wood and mud, permanent where everything else is temporary. You attend Mass on Sundays and holy days, which are numerous. The service is in Latin, which you do not understand, but the ritual is familiar and comforting. The priest speaks of sin and redemption, of the eternal rewards awaiting the faithful. The walls are painted with scenes of judgment. Christ enthroned, the saved ascending to heaven, the damned dragged down to hell by demons. These images are vivid, meant to inspire fear and obedience. Heaven is promised, but it seems far away. Hell feels closer, its torments easily imaginable. The church provides structure to time. The calendar is marked by feast days and saints' days: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the feast of St. John, the feast of St. Michael. These are the markers by which you measure the year. On feast days, there is a brief respite from labor, a slightly better meal, perhaps a little ale. The church also provides the sacraments: baptism for infants, marriage for couples, last rites for the dying. These rituals mark the transitions of life, lending them weight and meaning. But the church also takes. The tithe is collected rigorously. The priest lives better than you do, his house larger, his food more varied. The monastery or cathedral in the distance is wealthy, its lands vast, its buildings grand. You see this disparity, but do not question it, at least not openly. The social order is presented as divinely ordained. God placed the king on his throne, the nobles in their castles, the clergy in their churches, and you in the fields. To question this is to question God's will, which is heresy, which leads to punishment in this life and damnation in the next. Your legal status is bound up with the land. You are attached to the manor, a fixture as much as the trees and streams. If the manor is sold or granted to a new lord, you go with it. Your children inherit this status. If your daughter marries a man from another manor, a fee must be paid for her to leave. If your son wishes to apprentice in a town, permission must be obtained and payment made. Freedom is expensive, sometimes purchased over years or generations of accumulated savings. But for most, it remains a distant dream. Justice is administered by the manor court, presided over by the lord or his steward. Disputes between peasants are heard here. Arguments over boundaries, accusations of theft, quarrels over debts. The punishments are fines, usually additional payments to the lord, though more serious crimes might result in time in the stocks or whipping. Serious crimes like murder or rape are referred to the king's courts, but these are rare. Mostly, the manor court serves to extract additional revenue from the peasantry under the guise of maintaining order. There are moments of respite, festivals and celebrations rooted in older pre-Christian traditions but absorbed into the church calendar. May Day with its maypole dancing, midsummer with its bonfires, harvest home when the last sheaf is brought in. These occasions allow for music, dancing, communal feasting. Ale flows more freely. Tensions ease slightly. Young people court, friendships are renewed, old grievances are sometimes set aside. These moments are bright spots in the general greyness, brief interruptions in the rhythm of toil. You might wonder if peasants are aware of their exploitation, if they resent their condition. The historical record suggests the answer is complex. Certainly, there is grumbling. The manor records note frequent small acts of defiance. Peasants working slowly, accidentally damaging tools, taking small amounts of grain or wood. When pushed too far, when the demands become unbearable, peasants sometimes resist more openly. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, the Jacquerie in France, and similar uprisings across Europe demonstrate that resentment could boil over into violence. But such revolts were usually crushed brutally, their leaders executed, and the survivors returned to their bondage with renewed vigilance from their lords. Most of the time, resistance is quieter. Songs and stories told in the cottage, in the fields, express frustrations indirectly. Folk tales often feature clever peasants outwitting foolish lords or greedy clergy. These stories provide a release, a way to articulate grievances without direct confrontation. But the power structure is overwhelmingly stacked against you. The Lord has armed men, legal authority, the backing of the church and king. You have only your labor and your endurance. The daylight hours pass in repetitive motion, bending, lifting, carrying, digging. The sun arcs across the sky. Your back aches steadily. Your hands, already calloused, develop new blisters that harden into more calluses. Sweat soaks your tunic. In summer, the heat is oppressive, the sun relentless. In winter, the cold numbs your fingers and toes, making every task more difficult. There is no comfort, no ergonomic consideration, no concern for your well-being beyond your ability to continue working. Midday brings a brief pause. You sit in whatever shade is available or simply on the ground and eat. Perhaps a piece of black bread, an onion, a swig from a leather flask of weak ale. Ale is safer than water, which is often contaminated. Even children drink ale, though it is thin and low in alcohol. This meal is consumed quickly, and then the work resumes. The afternoon stretches ahead. Hours more of labor before you can return to your cottage. As evening finally approaches, you walk back to the village, your tools over your shoulder, your body utterly spent. The cottage is as you left it. The fire has been tended by whoever remained behind, perhaps your wife, perhaps a child. The evening meal is pottage again, ladled from the ever-simmering pot. You eat in near silence, too tired for conversation. Then, as darkness settles completely, you prepare for sleep. There is no light for reading, no leisure activities in the modern sense. Perhaps a brief prayer, recited from memory, perhaps a murmured conversation, and then sleep. The blessed oblivion of exhaustion until the next morning when the cycle begins again. This is your life, Day after day, year after year, the seasons turn, bringing their variations, but the fundamental pattern remains unchanged. You are born into this existence, you labor within it, and you die, likely in the same cottage, on the same strip of land, having never known any other way of living. Your grave will be unmarked or marked with a simple wooden cross that will rot away within a generation. Your name will be forgotten. But for now, in this moment, you are alive. You endure. And that itself is a kind of victory, small and quiet though it may be. The rhythm of their lives, the endless repetition, the weight of obligation and poverty gradually fades as you consider it from this distance. The morning will come for them tomorrow, as it came yesterday, as it has come for generation after generation. But for you here in the present, there is comfort, warmth, safety, and the freedom to let these images drift away as sleep approaches. The life we have just explored, the existence of the medieval peasant, was the life into which nearly everyone was born, and from which almost no one escaped. The social order was rigid, movement between classes nearly impossible. A peasant's child became a peasant. A lord's child became a lord. This was the natural order, the divine plan, questioned by almost no one. And yet, very occasionally, history produces an anomaly, a person so extraordinary, so inexplicable within the normal patterns of their time that their story seems to belong to legend rather than fact. One such person was Joan of Arc, known to the French as Jeanne d'Arc, a peasant girl who became a military commander, who crowned a king, and who died at 19 years old, burned at the stake as a heretic. Her story is remarkable, not despite her origins, but in many ways because of them. Let us move now from the general experience of peasant life to one specific life. One girl born in a small village who heard voices she believed came from heaven and who changed the course of a war and a nation. Joan was born around 1412, though the exact date is uncertain, as birth records for peasants were rarely kept. Her birthplace was Domremy, a small village in northeastern France, in the region of Lorraine. The village was unremarkable. Perhaps 50 households, scattered along a river valley, surrounded by fields and forest. Stone houses for the slightly more prosperous families, timber and mud for the rest. A church, simple and solid, sheep grazing on the hillsides. The slow rhythm of agricultural life, the same rhythm we have already explored. Her father was Jacques d'Arc, a peasant of somewhat better standing than most, not wealthy but secure. He held a small amount of land, enough to provide adequately for his family. He served as a village official on occasion, a position of minor authority. Her mother was Isabelle Romay, called such because she had once made a pilgrimage to Rome, a journey that marked her as devout and perhaps slightly more traveled than her neighbors. Joan had siblings, 3 brothers and a sister, a typical large family for the time. By all accounts, Joan's early childhood was ordinary. She helped with household tasks, with the animals, with the endless small labors that fill a peasant girl's days. She learned to spin wool, as all girls did. She did not learn to read or write. This illiteracy would later be used against her, cited as evidence of her unsuitability for the role she claimed. But literacy was not expected of her station. Her education was practical and religious. Prayers learned by rote, saints' days memorized, the rhythms of the church year internalized. The France of Joan's childhood was a broken nation. The 100 Years' War, that long, exhausting conflict between France and England over succession and territory, was in its 9th decade. English armies controlled much of northern France. The French crown was disputed. King Charles VI had died in 1422, leaving the succession in chaos. His son, Charles, claimed the throne, but had not been crowned, and large portions of France refused to acknowledge him. He was derisively called the Dauphin, the heir who could not inherit, the king who was not a king. The English king, Henry VI, was proclaimed King of France by the Treaty of Troyes. a document that disinherited Charles in favor of English rule. Domremy itself was on a border, a dangerous place. The village had declared for Charles, for the French cause, but surrounding territories were held by Burgundians who had allied with England. Raids were common. Villages were burned, livestock stolen, people killed or carried off. Joan grew up seeing soldiers, hearing stories of battles and sieges, witnessing the casual violence that accompanied war. The world beyond the village was dangerous and uncertain, filled with forces beyond any peasant's control. Around the age of 13, Joan began to experience something she would later describe as hearing voices. The exact nature of these experiences has been debated for centuries. Were they divine visions, as Joan believed? Hallucinations brought on by religious fervor, illness, or psychological stress? We cannot know with certainty. We can only know what Joan herself reported and what those around her observed. She said she heard the voices in her father's garden in the bright afternoon. The first time, she was frightened. A light accompanied the voice, she said, brilliant and overwhelming. The voice identified itself as Saint Michael, the warrior archangel. Later, she would hear other voices, Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, virgin martyrs who had died for their faith. These saints, she claimed, spoke to her in French, gave her instructions, told her she had a divine mission. The content of these messages was clear and specific. She was to go to the Dauphin Charles. She was to help him be crowned King of France. She was to drive the English from French soil. The mission was military, political, and explicitly connected to French national identity and the legitimacy of Charles's claim to the throne. For a 13-year-old peasant girl, these messages must have seemed impossible. She had no military training, no education, no social standing, no means of reaching the Dauphin, and no reason to believe anyone would listen to her if she tried. She initially resisted. She told no one about the voices for years, keeping them secret, perhaps hoping they would cease, perhaps unsure what to make of them herself. But the voices persisted. They became more urgent. By the time Joan was 16 or 17, she felt she could no longer ignore them. The military situation had become desperate. The city of Orléans, a critical stronghold for the French cause, was under siege by English forces. If Orléans fell, the path to the rest of France would lie open. The Dauphin's cause seemed hopeless. It was in this context that Joan finally decided to act. Her first step was to convince someone, anyone, to take her seriously. She approached Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the nearby garrison at Vaucouleurs. Imagine the scene. A teenage peasant girl, dressed in her rough red wool dress, her hair uncovered, her hands calloused from work, walking into a fortified town and demanding to see the military commander. She told him she needed an escort to Chinon, where the Dauphin held court. She told him she had been sent by God to save France. Baudricourt unsurprisingly dismissed her. He sent her away, possibly with mockery, certainly with disbelief. Joan returned home, but the voices, she said, gave her no peace. She came back to Baudricourt a second time, then a third. She was persistent, unyielding, and apparently convincing enough that a few people began to take her seriously. Soldiers and townspeople heard her speak and were moved by her certainty, her conviction. She made prophecies that appeared to come true, correctly predicting French military defeats before news of them arrived. Eventually, worn down or perhaps genuinely convinced, Baudricourt agreed to provide her with an escort. He gave her men's clothing, practical for travel and offering more protection than a woman's dress. He gave her a horse and a small group of soldiers to accompany her. In February 1429, Joan set out for Chinon, a journey of several hundred miles through territory that was often hostile, always dangerous. They traveled at night sometimes, avoiding main roads, moving through forests and across rivers. The journey took 11 days. Joan wore her borrowed men's clothing, her hair cut short for practicality. This adoption of male dress would later become one of the charges against her at her trial, cited as evidence of her defiance of natural and divine order. But for now, it was simply necessary for survival. At Chinon, she faced another seemingly impossible hurdle, gaining an audience with the Dauphin. Royal courts were elaborate hierarchies of protocol and gatekeeping. A peasant did not simply walk in and speak to the heir to the throne, but Joan's reputation had preceded her. Word of the girl claiming divine guidance had spread. Whether from curiosity, desperation, or genuine interest, Charles agreed to see her. The famous story, recorded in multiple sources, though perhaps embellished, tells that Charles tested her by disguising himself among his courtiers to see if she could identify him. Joan, according to the tale, walked directly to him despite his plain clothing and correctly identified him as the Dauphin. She told him she had come to help him win back his kingdom. She spoke with such conviction, such certainty that Charles was moved. He took her aside and they spoke privately. What was said in that conversation we do not know for certain, but afterward Charles's attitude changed. He began to take her seriously. Charles could not simply hand military authority to a peasant girl on her word alone, no matter how convincing she might be. The political and religious stakes were too high. If Joan was genuine, if she truly was sent by God, then supporting her was the obviously correct action. But if she was deluded, possessed by demons, or a fraud, then following her advice would be disastrous. Charles needed assurance. Joan was sent to Poitiers to be examined by theologians and church officials. For weeks, she was questioned by learned men, scholars, and clergy who probed her claims, her beliefs, her understanding of scripture and theology. Remember, Joan could not read. She had no formal religious education beyond the basics every peasant learned. Yet the record suggests she handled these examinations remarkably well, answering questions with a directness and simplicity that apparently impressed her examiners more than scholarly evasion would have. They asked her about the voices, about her mission, about her presumption in claiming divine guidance. They asked her theological questions, trying to trip her up in heresy. She replied with a kind of stubborn common sense. When asked for a sign that she was truly sent by God, she reportedly replied that the sign would be the relief of Orleans. The proof would be in action, not words. The theologians, surprisingly, found nothing objectionable in her claims. They concluded that there was nothing contrary to faith in her mission, and that given the desperate circumstances, the Dauphin would be justified in employing her. This was a remarkably cautious endorsement, but it was enough. Joan was given permission to accompany the army to Orleans. She was provided with armor, custom-made to fit her small frame, a suit of white plate armor, polished and bright, a sword, which she specifically requested be recovered from a chapel where she claimed it had been buried behind the altar. The sword was found where she said it would be, another event that enhanced her reputation as divinely guided. A standard was made for her, white cloth bearing the names of Jesus and Mary and images of angels. She would carry this banner into battle, she said, to avoid having to kill anyone with her own hands. The transformation was remarkable. Months earlier, she had been an illiterate peasant girl spinning wool in her father's house. Now she rode at the head of an army, armored and armed, addressed as La Pucelle, the maid, a title that emphasized her virginity and thus her purity and divine favor. The soldiers, initially skeptical, began to believe in her. She demanded that they attend Mass, that they confess their sins, that they stop swearing and consorting with camp followers. Remarkably, they obeyed. Orleans, in April 1429, was a city at the breaking point. English forces had surrounded it with a ring of fortified positions, bastilles, from which they controlled all approaches. Supplies were scarce, morale was low, and relief attempts had been repulsed. The siege had lasted months, and it seemed only a matter of time before the city fell. Joan's arrival changed everything, though not in the way one might expect. She did not command the army in a formal sense. Experienced military captains like Jean de Dunois were in actual command. But her presence had an effect that was harder to quantify. The soldiers believed in her. They fought with renewed energy, with a conviction that God was on their side. This morale boost in a medieval military context was enormously significant. The battles around Orléans were brutal. Medieval warfare, when it came to close combat, was a matter of armored men struggling hand-to-hand with swords, axes, and polearms. Men fell, their lives pouring out onto the ground. Arrows darkened the sky. The wounded screamed. Joan was in the midst of this, carrying her banner, urging the soldiers forward. She was wounded herself, an arrow through the shoulder during one assault, a painful injury that she bore without complaint, returning to the fight after it was bandaged. Within a week of Joan's arrival, the English positions around Orléans began to fall. One Bastille after another was stormed and taken. The English, unnerved perhaps by the sudden French confidence, withdrew from the siege. On May 8, 1429, Orléans was relieved. The impossible had happened. A city that had seemed doomed was saved, and the credit went largely to Joan la Pucelle, the peasant girl who had promised deliverance. The success at Orléans was followed by a series of rapid victories. Joan's mission was not simply to relieve one city, but to clear the way to Reims, where French kings were traditionally crowned. Until Charles was crowned at Reims Cathedral, his legitimacy would always be in doubt. Joan understood this with a clarity that was almost strategic. The voices, she said, had been explicit. Charles must be crowned. The French army moved through the Loire Valley, attacking English-held fortifications and towns. At Jargeau, at Meung-sur-Loire, at Beaugency, French forces were victorious. English commanders who had seemed invincible were defeated. The momentum had shifted entirely. At the Battle of Pottage, French forces caught an English army in the open and inflicted a devastating defeat, a reversal of the usual pattern where English longbowmen dominated French cavalry. Joan's role in these battles was not that of a tactical commander. She did not design the battle plans or maneuver the troops with strategic genius, but she was present. She carried her banner, she inspired the soldiers, and she seemed to embody something larger than herself. The French began to believe they could win. The English began to doubt. In the psychology of warfare, this shift was decisive. By mid-July, the road to Reims was open. Charles, who had been hesitant, who had doubted the wisdom of the campaign, finally committed to the journey. The army moved north, through territory that was not entirely secure, but which opened before them with surprisingly little resistance. Towns and fortifications that might have resisted instead chose to submit peacefully. The momentum was irresistible. On July 17th, 1429, in Reims Cathedral, Charles VII was crowned King of France. The ceremony followed the ancient rituals, the anointing with sacred oil, the crown placed on his head, the nobles swearing fealty. Joan stood nearby, holding her banner, tears streaming down her face. The mission the voices had given her was complete. She had taken a peasant girl from Domremy and placed a king on the throne of France. After the coronation, Joan's position became more complicated. She had accomplished what the voices told her to do. But the war was not over. English forces still held Paris and much of northern France. Joan wanted to continue fighting, to drive the English entirely from French soil. But Charles and his court were more cautious. They negotiated truces, sought diplomatic solutions, worried about the cost of continued warfare. Joan's military activity continued, but with less support, less coordination. In May 1430, she was involved in a skirmish near Compiègne, a town under siege by Burgundian forces. In the confused fighting, she was separated from her men and surrounded. She was pulled from her horse and captured. The Burgundians, allies of England, held her prisoner. The capture of Joan was a significant prize. The English and their Burgundian allies recognized that her symbolic importance was as great as her military role. She had given the French hope and confidence. Her presence had shifted the psychological balance of the war. Now captured, she could be used to reverse that effect. If she could be discredited, shown to be a fraud, a heretic, or a tool of demons, then her victories could be reinterpreted as temporary luck or devilish trickery. Joan was held in various castles, moved from place to place to prevent rescue attempts. She was kept in chains, guarded constantly, treated more like a criminal than a prisoner of war. She attempted to escape at least once, leaping from a tower in desperation, a fall that should have killed her, but left her only stunned and bruised. She was recaptured immediately. Eventually, she was sold to the English for a substantial sum. The English turned her over to the ecclesiastical court at Rouen, in English-held Normandy. She would be tried not by a military tribunal, but by the Church, accused not of military actions against England, but of heresy. The trial would be a religious and legal proceeding designed to destroy her reputation and justify her execution. The trial of Joan of Arc began in January 1431 and continued for months. It was presided over by Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a French cleric who had sided with the English cause. The proceedings were elaborate, meticulous, and deeply unfair. Joan was held in an English prison, chained, guarded by English soldiers, and denied access to anyone who might support her. She had no legal counsel, no one to advise her on the complex theological and legal questions she faced. The charges against her were numerous: heresy, witchcraft, wearing men's clothing, claiming direct revelation from God without the mediation of the Church. The trial transcripts which survive show Joan responding to her interrogators with remarkable consistency and intelligence. She was asked trick questions, theological traps designed to make her contradict herself or claim authority she did not have. She answered simply and directly, often deflecting questions she recognized as dangerous. When asked if she was in God's grace, a question with no safe answer for a person on trial for heresy, since claiming certainty of grace could be seen as presumptuous, while denying it would be an admission of sin, Joan replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The answer was so perfect that even her interrogators were silenced momentarily. She repeatedly stated that the voices came from God, that they had guided her truly, and that she regretted nothing she had done in obedience to them. She refused to renounce her mission or her belief in divine guidance. The court pushed her relentlessly, looking for any admission that could be construed as heresy. The question of her male clothing became particularly significant. Joan insisted that she wore men's clothes for practical reasons, for protection, and because the voices had commanded it. The court insisted that this was a violation of biblical law, a defiance of the natural order established by God. The Deuteronomy verse prohibiting cross-dressing was cited repeatedly. Joan's refusal to permanently abandon male clothing became one of the central charges. After weeks of interrogation, Joan was shown the instruments of torture and threatened with their use. She was told she would be tortured if she did not confess. Still, she maintained her position. Eventually, the court declared her a relapsed heretic, someone who had briefly recanted and then returned to her heretical beliefs, the evidence being that she had resumed wearing male clothing after promising to abandon it. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the old market square in Rouen. A crowd had gathered, a mixture of English soldiers, French townspeople, clergy, and curious onlookers. A large wooden stake had been erected, surrounded by bundles of wood. Joan was dressed in a woman's dress, her head shaved. She was 19 years old. She was allowed to speak briefly. Accounts differ on exactly what she said, but witnesses reported that she prayed, that she asked for a cross, and that she maintained her voices had been from God. A cross was improvised from sticks and given to her. She held it before her face as she was bound to the stake. The fire was lit. The flames rose quickly, fed by dry wood and pitch. Smoke billowed upward, thick and choking. Joan's death was not instantaneous. Fire as an execution method is a prolonged process, the body's suffering lasting minutes as the flames consume. She was heard to call out to Jesus, to invoke the saints, her voice growing weaker as the smoke overcame her. When it was over, the English executioner reportedly wept, saying he feared he had burned a saint. Her ashes were gathered and thrown into the Seine River to prevent any relics from being preserved, to ensure that nothing physical remained of the girl who had claimed divine mission. For the English, Joan's execution was meant to discredit her and by extension discredit Charles VII. If she was a heretic, then his coronation, which she had orchestrated, was tainted. But the effect was almost the opposite. The French remembered her as a martyr, as someone who had given everything for France. Charles, perhaps feeling guilt, certainly recognizing the political value, ordered a retrial decades later. In 1456, a church court overturned her conviction, declaring her innocent and affirming that she had died a martyr. Centuries later, in 1920, Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. The peasant girl who could not read, who wore armor and led soldiers, who heard voices and challenged every expectation of her station, was officially declared a saint. Her feast day celebrated on May 30th, the anniversary of her death. Her story resonates because it defies the rigid social structure we explored in the first segment. She should have remained a peasant, should have spent her life spinning wool and raising children and dying in obscurity. Instead, she became a warrior, a prophet, a kingmaker. Whether her voices were divine revelation, psychological phenomenon, or something else entirely, her achievement was real. She changed history. But she also paid the price for that achievement. She died young, died painfully, died abandoned by many of those she had helped. Her story is triumphant and tragic in equal measure. And as we contemplate it now, we can appreciate both the extraordinary heights she reached and the terrible cost she paid. The flames that consumed her in Rouen have long since cooled. The stake is gone, the ashes scattered. But the memory persists, the story of a peasant girl who heard voices and believed them, who convinced a king and saved a nation, and who died at 19, her mission complete, her name immortal. From this story of one extraordinary life, we turn now to something different, to the works that survived the medieval period, to the great cathedrals that still stand, and to the mystery of how they were built. We move now from individual lives, from the peasant's struggle and Joan's extraordinary triumph, to something that transcends individual human experience. We turn our attention to buildings, to structures of stone that have stood for 700, 800, 900 years. The Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe remain among the most remarkable achievements of human civilization, and yet the methods by which they were created remain partially shrouded in mystery, their builders having left few written records, their secrets passed down through guild traditions that valued oral teaching over documentation. Stand for a moment in your imagination before the facade of Chartres Cathedral or Notre Dame de Paris or Reims or any of the great Gothic churches that rose across Europe between the 12th and 16th centuries. Look upward. The towers soar impossibly high, stone rising in vertical lines that seem to defy gravity. The walls are not solid masses, but frameworks of stone pierced by enormous windows. Light pours through colored glass, transforming the interior into something that seems more divine than earthly. The scale is overwhelming, deliberately so. These buildings were designed to inspire awe, to make the individual human feel small before the glory of God. But how were they built? How did medieval craftsmen working without steel, without electricity, without modern mathematics or engineering calculations, create structures that remain standing today while many modern buildings have long since been demolished? This is the mystery we will explore now, gently, thoughtfully, understanding that some questions have answers while others remain tantalizingly uncertain. To understand Gothic architecture, we must briefly consider what came before. The earlier Romanesque style, dominant from roughly the 9th to the 12th centuries, was characterized by thick walls, small windows, and rounded arches. These churches were fortress-like, heavy and solid. The walls had to be massive to support the stone vaults of the ceiling. Large windows would have weakened the structure, so light was limited. The interiors were dim, the atmosphere solemn and enclosed. The Gothic style, emerging in the mid-12th century, represented a radical reimagining of what a church could be. The first true Gothic building is generally considered to be the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, near Paris. Rebuilt under the direction of Abbot Suger beginning in 1137, Suger wanted light, wanted the walls to dissolve into windows, wanted the church to feel like a gateway to heaven. To achieve this vision required solving significant structural problems. The key innovations of Gothic architecture were interdependent. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the flying buttress, and the gradual refinement of proportional systems that allowed builders to calculate the relationships between different parts of the structure. Together, these elements allowed stone buildings to reach unprecedented heights while using less material in the walls themselves. The pointed arch, as opposed to the rounded Romanesque arch, is more than an aesthetic choice. It is a structural innovation. A pointed arch directs weight more vertically downward, concentrating the load along more efficient lines. It can also be used to span different widths while maintaining the same height, providing greater flexibility in design. Imagine the ceiling of a Gothic cathedral. The vaults are divided into sections called bays by stone ribs that meet at keystone joints. These ribs form a skeletal framework, a web of stone that carries the weight of the vault to specific points on the walls and pillars below. The spaces between the ribs are filled with lighter stone, called webbing, which forms the actual ceiling surface but carries relatively little weight. This is fundamentally different from earlier barrel vaults or groin vaults, where the entire vault was a continuous mass of stone. The ribbed vault concentrates the structural load along specific lines, allowing the walls between these load-bearing points to be thinner, to be opened up for windows. The weight of the roof is channeled through the ribs, down through the pillars, and ultimately into the ground. But this creates a new problem. The pointed arches and vaults exert lateral thrust, sideways pressure that tries to push the walls outward. A tall, thin wall receiving this kind of pressure will collapse. The solution to this problem is the flying buttress. The flying buttress is perhaps the most visually distinctive feature of Gothic architecture. These are the arcing stone supports that leap across open space from separate buttress piers to the upper walls of the cathedral. They look almost like half arches frozen in stone, extending from massive vertical buttresses on the outside of the building to the points where the vaults meet the walls. Their function is to transfer the lateral thrust of the vaults outward and downward, channeling it into the heavy buttress piers, which in turn transfer it into the ground. The flying buttress allows the wall itself to be thin and filled with windows because the wall is no longer the primary structural support. The buttresses carry that load instead. The development of the flying buttress was gradual. Early Gothic builders used hidden buttresses concealed beneath the roof of the side aisles. Over time, these were exposed and refined into the soaring, arched forms we recognize. By the 13th century, master masons understood the flying buttress system thoroughly, building cathedrals with walls that were more window than stone. The structural load carried entirely by the skeletal framework of ribs, pillars, and buttresses. Stand outside a Gothic cathedral and observe the buttresses. They are tiered, often rising in 2 or 3 levels, each level corresponding to a point of thrust from the vaults inside. They are massive, heavy, adorned with pinnacles on top. These pinnacles are not merely decorative. They add weight to the buttress, helping to stabilize it and direct forces downward. Everything in Gothic architecture serves both aesthetic and structural purposes. Who designed these buildings? Who calculated the proportions, determined the placement of buttresses, decided how high the vaults could safely rise? The answer lies with the master masons, figures who occupied a position of considerable prestige and mystery in medieval society. Master masons were not architects in the modern sense. They did not typically produce detailed written plans. Instead, they worked from tradition, from accumulated knowledge passed down through guild structures, and from practical geometry. They understood stone, understood proportion, understood the behavior of structures under load, all through experience and the teaching of their masters before them. The training of a mason was long and rigorous. A boy would enter the trade as an apprentice, perhaps at age 12 or 14, and spend years learning the basics: how to cut stone, how to dress it to precise shapes, how to recognize good stone from poor. After years as an apprentice, he might become a journeyman, traveling from project to project, working under different masters, learning different techniques. Only after perhaps a decade or more of experience might he attempt to become a master himself, demonstrating his skill through a masterwork, a piece of craftsmanship that proved his abilities. Master masons belonged to guilds, organizations that controlled access to the trade, set standards, and jealously guarded trade secrets. These secrets were not written down. They were taught orally, passed from master to apprentice, protected from outsiders. A master mason's knowledge was valuable, literally so, as he could command high wages and favorable contracts based on his expertise. What did these secrets consist of? Partly, they were practical techniques: how to cut certain shapes, how to lift heavy stones, how to mix mortar for different applications. But they also included geometric systems for laying out buildings, proportional relationships between different elements, rules of thumb for determining the thickness of walls or the spacing of buttresses. Medieval masons worked with geometric constructions rather than mathematical calculations. They used tools like compasses, straight edges, and measuring rods marked with specific units. They laid out floor plans using geometric shapes, squares, circles, triangles, patterns that could be constructed with simple tools, but that embodied complex proportional relationships. One of the most important of these relationships was the ad quadratum system, based on the square and its diagonal. If you have a square and draw its diagonal, the ratio of the diagonal to the side of the square is the square root of 2, approximately 1.414 to 1. This ratio appears throughout Gothic architecture, relating the width of the nave to its height, the placement of pillars to the width of aisles, and numerous other dimensions. Similarly, the ad triangulum system, based on the equilateral triangle, provided another set of proportional relationships. These systems allowed masons to scale up their designs while maintaining harmonious proportions to ensure that a cathedral built over decades by different teams of workers would still be coherent and balanced. But these geometric systems were more than practical tools. They were also symbolic, reflecting medieval beliefs about the divine nature of mathematics and proportion. The universe, according to medieval theology, was created by God according to mathematical principles. God geometrizes, as the saying went. To build a church according to geometric harmony was to align the building with the divine order, to create on earth a reflection of heavenly perfection. Certain numbers held particular significance. The number 3 represented the Trinity, The number 4 represented the material world, the 4 elements, the 4 cardinal directions. The number 7, combining 3 and 4, represented completeness, the union of divine and earthly. 12 represented the apostles. These numbers appear repeatedly in cathedral designs: 12 pillars surrounding the apse, 7 chapels radiating from the ambulatory, 3 portals in the western facade. The actual construction of a Gothic cathedral was an undertaking that might span decades, sometimes centuries. Consider the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris, begun in 1163 and not completed until 1345, nearly 200 years later. Cologne Cathedral was begun in 1248 and not finished until 1880, more than 6 centuries after the first stone was laid. The process began with the quarrying of stone. Suitable stone had to be found, often at considerable distance from the building site. Limestone was preferred for its workability and durability. Quarrymen would split large blocks from the bedrock using wooden wedges driven into cracks, then wetted to expand and fracture the stone. These rough blocks were then shaped at the quarry into more manageable sizes before being transported to the construction site. Transportation was slow and expensive. Stone might be moved by ox cart, by barge along rivers, or simply by sheer human labor. The costs were enormous. Building a major cathedral required the resources of a wealthy diocese, supported by donations from the faithful, by taxes, by the income from church lands. The funding was rarely consistent, and construction often proceeded in bursts, followed by long pauses when money ran out. At the building site, the stones were further refined by masons, each stone cut to precise dimensions to fit its specific location. The precision required was remarkable. Stones that would be locked together hundreds of feet above the ground had to be shaped on the ground to fit exactly, because there was no opportunity for trial and error once they were in place. Lifting these stones required sophisticated equipment: treadwheel cranes, large wheels turned by workers walking inside like a hamster wheel, provided mechanical advantage to raise heavy loads. Pulleys and ropes, carefully maintained to prevent breaking under load, carried stones upward. Scaffolding, built from wooden poles lashed together, provided platforms for workers at increasing heights. The work was dangerous. Falls were common, as were injuries from falling tools or stones. Workers might labor at heights of 100 feet or more on narrow scaffolding in all weathers. There were no safety regulations, no insurance, no compensation for injury. A man who fell and was crippled might become a beggar if his family could not support him. Death was a constant companion on these sites. Yet the work progressed. Slowly, season by season, year by year, the walls rose. The pillars were erected first, massive columns of stone that would carry the weight of everything above. Then the arches between pillars, carefully built up using wooden centering, temporary frameworks that held the stones in place until the keystone was set and the arch became self-supporting. Only then could the centering be removed and reused for the next arch. The vaulting of the ceiling came later, after the walls and pillars were complete. Again, wooden centering was essential, elaborate frameworks that supported the weight of the vault until the mortar had cured and the stones locked together. The ribs went up first, defining the geometry of the vault. Then the webbing filled the spaces between ribs. Finally, the keystone at the apex of each vault section was set, locking everything together. Throughout this process, the master mason directed operations, making decisions about proportions, solving problems as they arose, adjusting the design to account for irregularities in the stone or variations from the planned dimensions. His knowledge was empirical, based on what had worked before, on understanding the behavior of stone and mortar through experience. Once the structure was complete, attention turned to the windows. In a Gothic cathedral, the windows are not mere openings, but elaborate frameworks of stone tracery filled with stained glass. The tracery, the decorative stonework that divides the window into sections, is cut with astonishing delicacy. stone made to seem almost lace-like, patterns of curves and points that are as structural as they are beautiful. The glass itself was a craft unto itself. Colored glass was made by adding metallic compounds to molten glass, cobalt for blue, copper for green, gold for red. The glass was blown and then flattened into sheets, never perfectly uniform, always with variations in thickness and color that give medieval glass its distinctive quality. The glass sheets were cut into shapes and assembled using lead strips called cames. The design was usually figured, depicting biblical scenes, saints, or symbolic imagery. These windows were not simply decoration, they were didactic, teaching tools for a largely illiterate population. A peasant who could not read could look at the windows and see the story of Christ's life, the lives of the saints, the progression from Old Testament to New. But the windows also served the original vision of Abbot Suger and those who followed to fill the church with light. The medieval understanding of light was theological. Light was a metaphor for divine presence, for God's grace, for spiritual illumination. A church filled with colored light filtering through stained glass was a space transformed, made transcendent, a physical environment that suggested the immaterial heaven. The cathedral labyrinths, patterns laid in the floor of the nave, present another puzzle. These are not true mazes, but single-path designs, elaborate circular patterns that lead from entrance to center and back out again. Their purpose is uncertain. Were they substitutes for pilgrimages, walked by those who could not travel to Jerusalem? Were they symbolic representations of the soul's journey? Were they simply decorative? We have theories, but no certain answers. The Gothic style, at its height in the 13th and 14th centuries, gradually gave way to other architectural modes. The Renaissance brought a renewed interest in classical forms, in columns and domes and horizontal lines, rather than Gothic verticality. Gothic architecture came to be seen as barbaric, medieval, the product of the Dark Ages. The term Gothic itself was originally an insult, suggesting the architecture of Goths, of barbarians who had destroyed Rome. Many Gothic buildings fell into disrepair. They were modified, had new facades, added in more fashionable styles, or were simply neglected. Some were damaged during periods of religious strife, particularly during the Protestant Reformation, when iconoclasm led to the destruction of stained glass and statuary. Others were secularized during revolutions, turned into warehouses or barracks. Their religious function ended. It was only in the 19th century, with the Romantic movement's renewed interest in the Middle Ages, that Gothic architecture was reassessed and appreciated. Scholars like Eugène Viollet-le-Duc in France studied medieval buildings systematically, documented their construction techniques, and advocated for their preservation and restoration. Gothic revival architecture became fashionable, new buildings built in conscious imitation of medieval styles. Today, the surviving Gothic cathedrals are treasured as cultural heritage, visited by millions, studied by scholars, and maintained with care. Modern structural analysis, using techniques like laser scanning and computer modeling, has revealed much about how these buildings work, how the forces flow through stone and mortar, how the buttresses and vaults function as systems. Yet even with all our modern knowledge, we cannot quite replicate what the medieval masons achieved. We can build taller, can use stronger materials, can calculate every detail precisely. But we cannot recapture the combination of empirical knowledge, craft tradition, symbolic intention, and sheer audacity that allowed illiterate stoneworkers to create buildings that still inspire awe 7 centuries after their completion. It is worth remembering as we contemplate these vast structures that they were built by people, not by machines, not by abstract forces, but by individual human beings. The quarrymen who split the stone, the carters who hauled it, the masons who cut and shaped it, the laborers who lifted it into place, men who woke in the morning, ate their bread, went to work, and returned home tired at day's end. Men who had families, who worried about money, who grew old and passed their knowledge to younger generations. The cathedrals bear witness to collective human effort, sustained across generations. A mason who laid stones in the foundation would never live to see the vaults completed. His children might work on the same building, and his grandchildren, each contributing to a project larger than any individual life. This long perspective, this patience, is itself remarkable in a culture that otherwise offered little stability or certainty. And what did they think, these builders, as they worked? Did they see themselves as creating monuments to God's glory? Did they take pride in their craftsmanship? Did they understand the mathematics and geometry they were employing, or did they simply follow the patterns handed down by tradition? We can speculate, but we cannot know their inner thoughts, their motivations beyond survival and wages. What we do know is that they succeeded. The cathedrals stand, Chartres and Notre Dame, Reims and Amiens, Cologne and Canterbury, and dozens more. They have survived wars and revolutions, fires and storms, centuries of weathering and human neglect. They remain, these forests of stone and glass, testaments to what human beings can achieve when skill, determination, and vision combine. As you imagine yourself standing in the shadowed nave, looking up at the vaults soaring overhead, at the ribbons of colored light falling through the windows, let yourself feel the weight of those centuries, the accumulated effort of all those anonymous hands. The stone is cold to the touch, solid, permanent, but it was shaped by human labor, by people who are long dust, whose names we will never know, but whose work remains. From these soaring spaces, from the mysteries of stone and light and impossible heights, we turn now to a different kind of medieval life. We move from the public grandeur of cathedrals to the enclosed world of monasteries, where some medieval people lived lives of relative comfort, scholarship, and routine quite unlike anything we have yet explored. We have explored the hardship of the peasant, the extraordinary trajectory of Joan, and the architectural achievements of the cathedral builders. Now we turn to a different medieval experience entirely, one that stood in stark contrast to the grinding poverty we began with. We enter the cloistered world of the monastery, specifically the Benedictine monasteries that dotted the European landscape. Institutions that were at once religious communities, centers of learning, economic powerhouses, and refuges for those who sought a life of relative comfort combined with spiritual devotion. The contrast is deliberate and striking. While peasants labored in fields and went to bed hungry, while most people struggled simply to survive, a select group of men lived behind monastery walls in conditions that could only be described as comfortable, even luxurious by medieval standards. This was not universal. Many monastic orders embraced poverty and austerity. But the Benedictine monasteries, particularly the wealthy houses with extensive lands and generous endowments, offered their members a quality of life far removed from the suffering of the wider world. Let us walk now through the gates of such a monastery, perhaps in the 13th or 14th century, at the height of monastic prosperity, and observe the daily rhythm of life within those walls. A Benedictine monastery was organized according to the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century by Benedict of Nursia. This rule established a framework for communal religious life, a balance of prayer, work, and study, governed by an abbot elected by the monks themselves. The rule emphasized stability, obedience, and moderation. Monks took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, committing themselves to a lifetime within the monastery. But the vow of poverty was collective, not individual. The monastery as an institution might be enormously wealthy, owning vast estates, receiving donations and bequests, collecting tithes and rents. This wealth supported the monastic community, allowing the monks to live well while technically owning nothing personally. The distinction was meaningful in theological terms, but perhaps less so in practical experience. A large Benedictine monastery was a complex of buildings arranged around a central cloister, a square courtyard surrounded by covered walkways. The church occupied one side, usually the north side, a substantial building that served both the monks and, in some cases, lay visitors. The other sides of the cloister held the chapter house where the monks met for daily business, the refectory where they ate, the dormitory where they slept, and various other buildings, the warming room, the infirmary, the library, the scriptorium. Beyond the central cloister lay additional structures. Guest houses for visitors, workshops where skilled craftsmen produced goods, storehouses for food and supplies, stables for horses, fish ponds, orchards and gardens. A wealthy monastery was essentially a self-contained village, with perhaps 50 to 100 monks, plus numerous lay servants and workers who handled tasks that the monks themselves did not perform. The monastery owned land, often extensive holdings. These lands were worked by peasants, some free, others bound in the same feudal relationships we explored earlier. The monastery collected rents and dues, sold surplus produce at markets, and accumulated wealth that was used to enhance the monastic life, to construct more elaborate buildings, to acquire books, and to ensure the community's prosperity. The monastic day was structured around the divine office, the cycle of prayers that marked the hours. These prayers, chanted in Latin in the monastery church, punctuated the day and night, creating a rhythm that never varied. The first service, matins, was sung in the deepest part of the night, around 2 or 3 in the morning. The monks rose from sleep in the dormitory, descended to the church, and stood in their choir stalls for an hour or more of psalms and prayers. After matins came lauds, sung at dawn, followed by prime at the first hour of daylight, then terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the afternoon, vespers in the evening, and finally compline before bed. 7 or 8 services daily, each requiring the monks' attendance, each consisting of carefully prescribed texts sung to ancient melodies. This might sound arduous, and for monks committed to strict observance, it was demanding. But in wealthy monasteries, the services were often abbreviated, the chanting hurried, the atmosphere less one of intense devotion than of routine obligation. Some monks attended faithfully, while others found ways to minimize their presence. The abbot might excuse older monks or those engaged in important scholarly work from some services. Between these religious obligations, the monks had time for other activities: meals, study, work in the scriptorium or library, administrative duties for those holding monastic offices, and periods of rest. The schedule varied by season, adjusting to the changing hours of daylight, but the overall pattern remained consistent year-round. Let us follow the monks to the refectory, the dining hall, for the midday meal. The refectory is a large room, often with high ceilings and tall windows that admit ample light. Long tables run the length of the room, with benches on either side. At one end is a raised platform, where the abbot and senior monks sit. At the other end is a pulpit, from which one monk reads aloud during the meal, usually from scripture or the lives of saints. The monks enter in procession silently and take their places. A bell rings, a prayer is said, and the meal begins. The rule of Benedict prescribed simple food, but in practice, the meals in wealthy monasteries were abundant and varied, far exceeding the plain fare of peasant life. The first course might be a thick pottage, but this is not the thin gruel of peasant cottages. This pottage is rich, made with good grains, flavored with herbs from the monastery garden, perhaps enriched with eggs or cream. It is served in proper bowls, eaten with spoons, accompanied by bread. The bread itself is wheat bread, white and fine, carefully leavened and baked in the monastery's ovens. There is no shortage. Each monk receives a generous portion, and more is available if desired. Butter might accompany the bread, a luxury most peasants never taste. Then comes fish. The rule forbids meat except for the sick and elderly, but this prohibition is interpreted flexibly. Fish is not considered meat, so fish appears frequently, but not simple river fish. The monastery's ponds are stocked with carp, pike, and other desirable species. The fish is prepared with care, sometimes boiled, sometimes baked, sometimes in elaborate sauces. On feast days, imported fish might appear, salted cod from the North Atlantic, herring from the Baltic, luxuries that required wealth to obtain. Then vegetables. Cabbage and onions, yes, but also leeks, beets, turnips, parsnips, prepared with skill rather than simply boiled into submission. Herbs season everything: parsley, sage, thyme, mint, all grown in the monastery garden and used with understanding of flavor. The food is not merely sustenance, it is cuisine. Cheese follows. Good cheese made from the milk of the monastery's dairy cattle, aged in cool cellars, brought to the table in generous portions. Perhaps fruit, depending on the season. Apples, pears, plums from the monastery orchards. In season, fresh. Out of season, dried or preserved. And ale or wine to drink. Weak ale is standard, consumed in quantity, safer and more pleasant than water. But on feast days, or simply because the cellar is well stocked, wine might appear. Good wine from the monastery's own vineyards or purchased from regions known for viticulture. The monks drink moderately, as the rule prescribes, but they do not go thirsty. The meal concludes with a prayer of thanksgiving. The entire experience has lasted perhaps an hour. The monks have eaten well, not gorged themselves, but certainly satisfied their hunger with food of quality and variety that would astonish a peasant. And this happens twice daily, the midday meal and a lighter supper in the evening. The rule technically forbids a second meal except during certain seasons, but exceptions are made routinely. The monks justify this by noting that their scholarly work requires nourishment, that the climate necessitates adequate food, that the rule must be interpreted with practical wisdom. The result is that monks in wealthy houses eat better than nearly anyone else in medieval society, except the nobility. After the meal, some monks proceed to the scriptorium, the room dedicated to the copying and illumination of manuscripts. This is perhaps the most famous aspect of monastic life, the image of monks hunched over desks, quill pens in hand, painstakingly copying ancient texts. The scriptorium in a major monastery is a large, well-lit room, often on an upper floor to maximize natural light. Windows are large and numerous, glass in the wealthier houses, allowing light without draught. The room is equipped with individual desks, each positioned to catch the light. In winter, it is one of the few heated spaces in the monastery, braziers providing warmth because cold fingers cannot write properly. Each desk is a small workshop. The monk sits on a bench, the writing surface at a slight angle before him. His tools are laid out, quills cut from goose feathers, sharpened to precise points, inkwells containing black ink made from oak galls, soot and gum arabic, colored inks and pigments for decoration, a knife for scraping away errors, pumice for smoothing the parchment surface, a straight edge and compass for laying out pages. The parchment itself is precious, made from animal skins, usually calf, sheep or goat. Properly prepared parchment is smooth, durable, and accepts ink beautifully. But it is expensive. A single large Bible might require the skins of 300 animals. The parchment is prepared elsewhere by specialists, then cut to size and delivered to the scriptorium in stacks. The monk copies text. His exemplar, the book he is copying from, is propped up where he can see it clearly. He reads a phrase, holds it in memory, then writes it carefully onto the fresh parchment. The work demands concentration. Errors must be avoided, or else laboriously scraped away. The handwriting must be consistent, legible, beautiful. Different scripts are used for different types of books. The formal liturgical script for service books, a more compact script for theological texts, specialized scripts for legal or medical works. The pace is slow. A skilled copyist might produce 3 or 4 pages in a day. A large book might take months to complete, and this is only the copying. Illumination, the decoration of the manuscript with colored designs and illustrations, takes additional time. The illuminator's work is meticulous artistry. First, the spaces for decoration are left blank by the scribe. Then the illuminator sketches the design in light pencil or chalk. The backgrounds are painted first, often in gold leaf applied with gum and burnished to a brilliant shine. Then the colors, brilliant blues from lapis lazuli, reds from vermilion or madder, greens from verdigris, yellows from orpiment. These pigments are ground fine, mixed with egg white or gum, and applied with fine brushes. Monks read these texts. Serious, scholarly monks immerse themselves in study, becoming experts in theology, canon law, or other disciplines. They write commentaries, compose treatises, engage in intellectual work that circulates among other monasteries and universities. The monastery is a center of learning, its library a resource available to its members in ways that the illiterate outside world cannot imagine. Young monks receive education within the monastery. The novice master teaches Latin, the essential skill, along with grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Promising students progress to theology and philosophy. The monastery school is where Europe's intellectual elite are formed, where boys from noble families are sent to become educated clerics, where future bishops and abbots receive their training. This is far from the ignorant peasant existence we explored at the beginning. These monks are literate, educated, surrounded by books and learning. They live in a world of ideas, of texts, of intellectual engagement. It is a privileged existence, accessible only through entry into the monastery. But for those who choose or are chosen for this life, it offers opportunities for scholarship unmatched anywhere else in medieval society. Winter in a monastery is cold, as it is everywhere in medieval Europe. But unlike peasant cottages, where cold is simply endured, the monastery provides some relief. The warming room, one of the few heated spaces besides the scriptorium, is where monks gather during the coldest months. The warming room contains a large fireplace, kept burning throughout winter. Here, monks come to thaw frozen fingers, to warm themselves before and after services in the unheated church, to sit in relative comfort for brief periods. The rule restricts how long one may linger, encouraging monks not to become soft, but the warming room exists because even ascetics recognize limits to productive suffering. The infirmary offers another haven. Old monks, sick monks, those recovering from injuries or illness, are housed in the infirmary, where standards of comfort are relaxed. Meat is permitted for the sick, additional blankets provided, fires kept burning. Some monks, as they age, contrive to spend increasing time in the infirmary, claiming minor ailments that justify residence there. The infirmarian, the monk in charge, often tolerates this because he is merciful, or because he too enjoys the relative comfort and does not wish to be strict. The dormitory where monks sleep is unheated, but the beds are adequate. Each monk has a mattress, not of straw but of wool or feathers, raised off the ground on a wooden frame. Blankets are provided, good wool blankets, enough to keep warm even on cold nights. The monks sleep in their habits, the long robes they wear during the day, but they are not shivering and miserable as peasants often are. Privacy is limited. The dormitory is communal with beds arranged in rows, but some senior monks have private cells, small rooms with a door, space for a desk, and a few personal items. The abbot has his own lodging, separate from the dormitory, with a fireplace, private rooms for sleeping, dining, and receiving visitors. His life is comfortable by any standard. There is an obvious contradiction here. The monks have taken vows of poverty. They have renounced the world, dedicating themselves to God, claiming to prioritize spiritual over material concerns. Yet they live in comfort, eat well, enjoy heated rooms, pursue intellectual interests. How is this reconciled? The theological answer is that their poverty is communal, not individual. They own nothing personally, everything belongs to the monastery. This distinction satisfies doctrine, even as it allows comfortable living. The practical answer is that wealthy monasteries, having accumulated resources, use those resources to support their members. The monks rationalize that good food and adequate comfort allow them to perform their duties better, that suffering for its own sake is not mandated, that moderation is a virtue. Some critics, even in the medieval period, pointed out the hypocrisy. Reformist movements within monasticism, groups like the Cistercians or Carthusians, explicitly rejected the Benedictine comfort, returning to stricter poverty. Preachers and moralists criticized wealthy monasteries for their departure from apostolic simplicity. But the wealthy houses continued, protected by their endowments, supported by powerful patrons, justified by their role in preserving learning and providing prayers for the souls of benefactors. The monks themselves, for the most part, do not seem troubled by the contradiction. They perform their duties, attend the services, work in the scriptorium or library, administer the monastery's estates, and accept the comfortable life as their due. This is the existence they have chosen or been chosen for, and they inhabit it without excessive questioning. Monasteries, despite being enclosed communities, maintain contact with the outside world. The guest house accommodates visitors, pilgrims traveling to holy sites, merchants, nobles, emissaries on official business. The rule of Benedict mandates hospitality, welcoming guests as if they were Christ himself. The guest house is separate from the main monastic buildings, allowing visitors without disturbing the cloister. Guests are provided with meals, lodging, and care. Wealthy visitors might be entertained lavishly, provided with private rooms, served elaborate meals, engaged in conversation by the abbot and senior monks. The monastery benefits from these connections. Donations result. Relationships are cultivated, news and information flow in. Some monasteries operate inns or hostels, providing services for travelers for a fee. Others maintain almshouses, distributing food to the poor at the monastery gates. The extent of charity varies. Some houses are generous, others perfunctory, doing the minimum required to maintain their reputation for piety. The monastery also interacts with the wider world through its economic activities. Monastic estates are managed by officials who deal with peasants, negotiate contracts, collect rents. Surplus produce is sold at markets. The monastery might operate mills, fisheries, salt works, or other enterprises. These activities generate the wealth that supports the monastic community, and they require monks or lay administrators to engage with secular business. Some monks serve outside the monastery in various capacities, as bishops, as advisors to nobles or kings, as teachers in universities. The boundary between monastic life and the wider world is porous, especially for those with education and connections. A talented monk might rise to positions of considerable power and influence, using his monastic foundation as a springboard for a career in the church hierarchy. Monks grow old within the monastery. Having entered perhaps as teenagers, they spend decades in the same community, following the same routine. The elderly are treated with respect, their long service acknowledged. They are excused from the more demanding duties, allowed to spend more time in prayer or contemplation, provided with extra comforts in the infirmary. When a monk dies, he is buried in the monastery cemetery, often within the cloister or in a churchyard adjacent to the monastery church. A simple grave, marked with a cross or stone, his name recorded in the martyrology, the book listing the monastery's dead. Services are said for his soul, prayers offered. His death is mourned, but it is also understood as the completion of earthly service, the transition to eternal reward. The monastery continues. New novices enter, replacements for those who have died. The cycle of prayer and work goes on, unchanging. The institution is permanent, outlasting the individuals who compose it. This sense of continuity, of being part of something larger and more enduring than a single life, is part of the appeal of monastic existence. A monk's life has structure, meaning, purpose, all embedded within a community that will endure long after he is gone. As we prepare to leave this exploration of monastic life, it is worth reflecting on what these monks possessed that was perhaps most valuable: access to learning. In a world where illiteracy was nearly universal, where knowledge was restricted to a tiny elite, the monastery library represented something extraordinary. Books, hundreds of them, containing the accumulated wisdom of centuries, available to be read, studied, absorbed. A monk who spent his life in the scriptorium and library had opportunities for intellectual development that were simply impossible for anyone outside such institutions. He could read the classics, study theology, engage with ideas. He might become an expert in canon law or biblical exegesis or natural philosophy. His mind was cultivated, sharpened, expanded in ways that the overwhelming majority of medieval people never experienced. This was a privilege, and it was recognized as such. Families who placed sons in monasteries often did so precisely to provide them with education and opportunities. The monastery was a path to advancement, to a life that was not only comfortable, but intellectually rich. For those with scholarly inclinations, it was perhaps the best option available in medieval society. But access was limited. Not every boy could become a monk. Social status mattered. Many monasteries preferred recruits from noble or at least prosperous families. A donation was expected when a novice entered. Peasant boys rarely had access to this world. The comfortable, scholarly life of the monastery was a privilege of class as much as of religious vocation. We have walked through the monastery, observed its routines, tasted its food, seen its books, felt the warmth of its fires. The contrast with the peasant's life is stark. While one group labored in fields and went to bed hungry, another group lived behind walls, eating well, reading books, enjoying comforts that would be unimaginable to those outside. Both lives existed simultaneously. Both were medieval lives, but they were separated by vast chasms of experience and opportunity. The monastery represents one of the great paradoxes of medieval life. An institution dedicated to poverty and spiritual renunciation that became wealthy and comfortable. A community of men who had supposedly turned their backs on the world, but lived better than most people in that world. It is neither wholly admirable nor wholly condemnable, but simply another facet of the complex, contradictory, endlessly fascinating medieval period. From this comfortable, cloistered world, we now step back, draw together the threads of this long journey, and prepare to return to the present. We have traveled far tonight, across centuries and social classes, through lives of hardship and extraordinary achievement, through soaring stone cathedrals and comfortable monastery halls. We began in the darkness of a peasant's cottage, where life was labor and hunger and cold. We followed Joan of Arc, from that same peasant class to battlefields and coronations, to triumph and ultimately to the flames. We stood in Gothic cathedrals and wondered at the mystery of their construction, and we ended in monasteries where some medieval people lived lives of scholarship and relative ease. The medieval period, that 1,000-year span we call the Middle Ages, was not one thing but many things. It contained the grinding poverty of the peasant and the comfortable life of the monk. It produced Joan of Arc, impossible and real. It created cathedrals that still inspire awe. Within one historical moment, these wildly different experiences coexisted, separated by birth and circumstance. by walls and social structures, by access to power and knowledge. What stands out, perhaps, as we reflect on these stories, is how much has changed. The peasant's life of unrelenting toil, of hunger and bondage, has largely passed from the Western world. We no longer live in societies where most people are legally bound to the land, where starvation is a constant threat, where life expectancy barely reaches 40. The rigid feudal hierarchy has dissolved. Social mobility exists. Education is widespread. We have comforts that medieval nobility could not imagine. Warmth at the touch of a switch, light after dark, food in abundance, medicine that cures rather than merely hopes. Yet some things remain. The capacity for extraordinary individuals to transcend their circumstances, as Joan did. The human drive to create beauty and meaning, embodied in the cathedrals. The appeal of communal life dedicated to higher purposes, which drew men to monasteries. The fundamental human experiences of birth and death, of love and loss, of striving and hoping. These transcend historical period. As you lie here now, in warmth and safety, with food in your belly and a comfortable bed beneath you, you can appreciate how much separates your life from the lives we have explored tonight. The struggles of medieval peasants are not your struggles. You will not wake before dawn to work fields you do not own. You will not face famine or plague. You will not be tried for heresy or burned at the stake. You will not spend your days copying manuscripts by candlelight. But you can understand, across that gulf of centuries, something of their humanity. They were people like you. They woke each morning and faced their days. They loved their families. They found meaning where they could. They endured. And in enduring, in surviving, in creating the cathedrals and manuscripts and stories that survived them, they left traces that allow us to glimpse their world. Let those images fade now. The peasant's cottage, smoke-filled and dark. Joan in her armor bearing her banner, the soaring vaults of the cathedral, the monk in his scriptorium, pen in hand. Let them recede into the distance they came from, 7 or 8 or 900 years away, separated from you by all the accumulated changes of history. You are here now, in the present. The weight of centuries rests lightly on you. The medieval world is gone, surviving only in ruins and records, in stories we tell ourselves about where we came from. And that is as it should be. The past is past. Its struggles are over. Its people have found whatever peace awaited them. Rest now, let the journey end. Close your eyes and let sleep come gentle and inevitable, carrying you away from history into dreams, into the quiet darkness that welcomes all who have traveled far. Breathe slowly, release the images, release the thoughts. Simply be here, comfortable, safe, drifting, letting go. The medieval world sleeps in its long silence, and you, having visited it briefly, return to your own time, to your own life, to your own rest. Good night.